The cockpit was cast in twilight, shrouded in shadows, barely illuminated by the blue glow of the command console and the magnificent white light of the nearby sun. Utter silence filled the cockpit more greatly than light. The pilot reclined in his seat and stared up at the stars through the glass, his eyes appearing glazed over as if he were staring through the void and into eternity itself. All throughout the ship emanated a cacophony of noise, screaming, crashing, banging, running, crying. Sparks crackled from panels, and fire raged further down the halls. Red lights dimly lit the corridors, alarms blaring at deafening frequencies. He ran. She followed right on his heels. Everything had happened so quickly and without warning. There was no build-up, no signs of the imminent disaster. Within a mere moment, the ship had descended into utter chaos. How fast things had all gone to hell. All that mattered now was survival. All that mattered now was them. The pair turned a corner and were shocked at the horrors that greeted them around the bend. Blood painted the walls and bodies littered the floor. Several creatures stood amongst the bodies, their long, insectile legs twitching as their elongated snouts penetrated the skulls of their victims. The creatures froze at the sound of the onlookers' footsteps, their heads turning and shaking as they eyed their new potential prey. They knew nothing but the urge to consume. He reached for her hand, for a sign of comfort, though, as his fingertips graced hers, the parasites let out a horrendous symphony of screeches before charging the couple. They skittered along the ground and walls, moving as a pack. The duo turned and ran, realizing they'd have to find another path. The snout of one of the parasites twisted like a whip, lashing out violently and wrapping around her ankle. She yelped as she fell to the floor, clawing desperately at the ground as she was pulled. He grabbed onto her hand and pulled back, engaging in a tug-of-war with the creature. As he pulled harder, the beast's neck split and its head was torn from its body. Its snout was unwrapped from her ankle, and the two ran again. The pack moved past the decapitated parasite. It began to twitch and quiver until a new body grew from the severed head, the body also growing a new head and creating two where one once stood. They found a room and slammed the door behind them, grabbing the nearest large objects and shoving them in front of the doors. Skittering and screeching permeated through as the parasites pounded into the steel in search of a way in. When the two felt secure, they stopped to catch their breath. Their eyes locked, her pale blue eyes shimmering like those distant pictures of the earth. Even in this chaos, for a brief moment, the two found solace in one another's gaze. They stepped towards one another, arms raised to embrace each other. Still clanged, and another screech filled the air. This time, certainly from inside the room, then outside the door. The two turned in their panic and watched as another parasite finished its meal and now began to size them up. It leaped through the air, and he threw himself in front of her, taking the beast head on. He fell to the ground and struggled with the creature. His hands fought back its legs and that needle-like snout, but the creature was surprisingly strong for its small and skinny stature. With violent force, the parasite was thrown off and slammed into the wall, its disgusting orange blood running down the steel as it twitched with its last breath. He panted as he looked up to see her holding a steel plate smeared with some orange goop. He stood, and the two entered some kind of silent agreement. They had no time to be thankful for their lives or each other. They needed to worry about their survival. Fortunately, the room they found themselves in was a rather large supply room. Immediately, the two went to work, splitting up to comb every corner of the room in search of weaponry. He procured simple things, a bat, a belt, and a few pieces of lead pipe. Choosing his best option, he prepared to return to her with the rest, but was halted as the sound of the doors bursting open cut through his train of thought. He turned to see the horde of parasites coming his way again. His mind raced. His eyes darted around the room. Where was she? He opened his mouth to call her name, but felt the words become stuck in his throat as the parasites closed in. He wanted nothing more than to ensure her safety, than to protect her. He would gladly throw himself in harm's way just to save her, but for now she was nowhere to be found. His mind was left with the choice, and he made a snap decision. With a heavy heart, he turned towards the back exit and fled, the parasites hot on his tail. The thick silence of the cockpit was pierced by a series of shrill beeps. He sat up in his seat and looked down at the command console. The transmitter flashed red, indicating it had picked up an SOS signal. For a moment, he considered his options. Someone was in distress and needed help, and this solar system was so remote that it was likely he was the only one picking up the signal. Yet, the idea of interaction with another being seemed awful. There was only one thing on his mind, and if he couldn't have it, he wouldn't have anything. But the good in him would not let him simply turn away. With a sigh, he took control of the ship and followed the distress beacon to its source. He found himself upon the surface of an unfamiliar planet. A perpetual and turbulent storm raged overhead. Clouds of indigo and violet gave birth to crimson and cobalt lightning that cut through the sky. Winds drowned out all other noise, and thunder shook the very ground itself. But within this storm stood a facility, and the distress call was most certainly coming from inside there. The door was pried open with a little bit of force, and he let himself in. An eerie silence fell over the place as the sounds of the storm outside were muffled. Blood stained the walls and floors of this facility, though it appeared old and dried. Whatever had happened here had happened more than a few hours ago. That much was certain. Still, he drew the gun he carried and headed further in carefully. It was unlikely anyone had survived, but still he found himself compelled to move further into the complex. A small device was pulled from his pocket, and he pressed several buttons upon the screen. After a moment, the mechanized door in front of him chimed and slid open. In this room, a familiar sound tickled his ears. A strange sound, one he had not heard in ages. The parasites turned to look at him, letting out their choir of screeches before charging at him. His heart pounded and he moved quickly, his mind racing. Was this life playing some cruel trick on him? Was he being forced to relive his nightmare? Up ahead at the bend of the corridor, he caught sight of a humanoid figure turn and dart away. He called out but received no answer. If there was a survivor here, it was his duty to help them escape. Just as before, the doors were slammed shut behind him and barricaded with anything he could find around the room. This time, however, he wasted no time and continued forward. There was potentially a life at stake here besides his own, and for the first time in a while, it gave him something to care about, something to strive for. Up ahead, the shadows moved. He leveled his gun and prepared to fire, but watched as the shadows seemed to take shape as a figure stepped out of them. Though it was dark and had been God knows how long, there was no mistaking that form, those eyes, that hair, that smile. She lifted a finger to shush him, just as another symphony of screeching reverberated through the vents. Her hand gestured for him to follow, and she turned around the corner, vanishing as quickly as she had appeared. His mind told him this was a trick. It told him that she wasn't here. It told him that she was dead. But still he had to know. He had to see. He had to understand why he had been called out here, and why here of all places was he seeing her again. The parasites broke through a sealed door and into the hall. He turned and fired several shots into the pack, dropping only one of the beasts in 7 shots. His weapon was ineffective and useless here. All he could do was run. All he could do was search for an answer. His heart pounded and sweat dripped down his face as he ran further through the facility. Every now and then, he would see her up ahead, beckoning him to push forward. At this point, he had no other choice. He bounded up the stairs in a hurry, hearing the skittering and screeching of the parasites behind him. The door before him was pushed open, and suddenly the world was thrust into a deafening silence. He found himself on the rooftop of the facility. The tower he stood upon was grand, standing tall enough to penetrate the thick storm clouds that covered the planet below. Up here, he could see the warm, golden sky and the bright, calming light of the nearby sun. Standing at the edge of the rooftop was her. He smiled at simply being able to see her again, even if it was not really her. It was nice to have something more than a memory of her, even if for only a moment. How he missed her. How he regretted the choice he had made every day. He took a step forward and she turned to face him. Her face twisted and contorted until it resembled something like the parasites. Just then, the world seemed to explode into chaos again as the door behind him was thrown open and the parasites continued their charge towards him. For a moment, he stood completely still, unsure of how to handle this. His hand shook and the gun he held fell with a clatter. The answer was simple. There was nothing left to do. The parasites crawled up his back, their long snouts extending and pointing at the back of his neck. At the same time, the parasite woman closed in and outstretched a hand towards him, hunger in her eyes just like the rest of the scum. A black spot appeared in the center of the sun, rapidly growing as a black hole tore through the delicate star. It grew exponentially, consuming all: the star, the facility, the planet, the light, the sound. Quickly, everything was reduced to nothing. Back in the cockpit, the world fell into silence again. The pilot laid back in his chair, his eyes still gazing up into the stars, not having moved an inch. A light dripping sound disturbed the silence as blood dripped from his wrists down onto the steel floor of the bridge. From his open, lifeless mouth crawled one of the infantile parasites.